Okay, why don't we get rolling? Welcome to BIOMES, the first BIOMES of the semester. The BIOMES crew worked really hard over break to put forth a great lineup, what we think is a great lineup. And we're really excited to kick it off today with James Prosek. I wanted to start a little differently by just naming some of James' accomplishments and then talking a little bit more about him. As you'll see, and if you didn't know, James is an artist and author. His work has been shown at the Smithsonian Museum of Art, American Art Museum, the Royal Academy of Art in London, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Asia Society Hong Kong Museum, just to name a few. James has 12 books, or over 12 books, and has written for the New York Times and the National Geographic. He won the Peabody Award in 2023. He co-founded a conservation initiative called World Trout with Yvon Chouinard, right, the founder of Patagonia. And in 2012, won the Gold Medal of Distinction in Natural History Art from the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philly. It's really hard to sort of pin James down and summarize him, right? He's an artist, a writer, and a scholar. He's an extremely thoughtful and insightful person, as you'll see, who has the ability to sort of convey this through many different mediums and then write about his thought process and his processes through books. This is something he's done since he published his first book at the age of 19 while he was an undergrad here at Yale. The book is called Trout, An Illustrated History, and it really sort of set the marker for his career. It's sort of a culmination of his fascination with fish and painting fish that he started as a child. It does a really amazing and excellent job at portraying the beauty and diversity of trout, which for those of you who know them are a particularly diverse and beautiful species. James is a Connecticut native. And here he's a curatorial affiliate at the Peabody Museum. He's also on their sort of museum board, and he's on the advisory board of YIBS. Many of you work with YIBS. So he's been around here. I've known James for a while. I've enjoyed a number of his talks and exhibits. And so he's been working a lot and thinking a lot about the interconnectivity of nature and sort of the holistic qualities of nature. And as you're going to see here, his work has now built upon itself and contains a depth that you only get through working on something from a long time. And it's benefited from his numerous projects and his sort of really complex and cool life journey. So we're in for a treat. I'd like us to sort of welcome James.
Thank you. Thank you.
James is also a hugger.
Sorry. I feel like hugging is more hygienic than grabbing a hand, right? But this is even better. Pete, thank you for that beautiful introduction. And I'm a big fan of Yale and the resources, the people who are part of the resources. I've been coming here since I was a kid to go to the Peabody Museum with my father. And I had a friend whose father went to Yale, and we used to go to hockey games when I was a kid. So I am just I like it here, and I'm honored to be here today. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me come to speak here. Should I speak for maybe 45 minutes or so? And sometimes I'm not very good at brevity, so sorry for that. I'll do my best. But so many people here have been supportive of my work. You know who you are, so thank you. And I advance just by hitting this arrow, I guess, right? Some of you have seen me talk several times. Some of you know about my work. Some of you know nothing about my work. So I'm going to kind of start from scratch and just give a little overview of what I do and try to run through a lot of different things. And I'll just stop when the time runs out. As Pete mentioned, I grew up in western Connecticut in a town called Easton, about 30 minutes west of here. Easton is north of Bridgeport, which was a growing, prosperous city in the early 1900s. And the leaders of Bridgeport knew that they would need a lot of drinking water. So they basically looked north and they found this town, Easton, that had some rivers. And they took the valleys through eminent domain and they dammed a couple of the rivers to form these drinking water reservoirs. P.T. Barnum was the mayor of Bridgeport. He actually was the first owner of the water company. He had a lot of powerful friends in government, so it was sort of a little corrupt. But at the time, it was probably hard for the farmers who had to leave their land because their homes were going to be flooded. But as a consequence, fast forward to today, about 80% of my town is open space because they also preserved a lot of land around the reservoirs as part of the watershed to keep the water clean. So as a kid, I grew up on this street that dead ended on one of the reservoirs, and I happen to still live on the same street, 2 houses away from the house where I grew up. And so I have a very strong sense of place, I guess, or I've been there 48 years, my whole life. So the street I live on used to continue into the rest of the town of Easton, but once they built the dam on the Mill River, the valley got flooded, so that my street dead ends on the reservoir. And as a kid, walking down to the end of the street, I would encounter these no trespassing signs. Around the age of 9, I was introduced to fishing, and I became like fanatical about fishing for bass and trout and things. And so to have a several mile long body of water that nobody was allowed to go to as my private fishing place was pretty cool. And a no trespassing sign was like a welcome here sign for a 9-year-old kid who liked to be in the woods. One of my favorite verses in This Land Is Your Land by Woody Guthrie is, I might as well sing it. As I was walking, I saw a sign there, and on the sign it said no trespassing, but on the other side it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. So trespassing has become kind of a theme of my work. I didn't even realize that until many years later, but this sign on this sugar maple tree has also sort of articulates what my life's work has been about, maybe better than I can. I remember 30 years ago or so when they replaced the old signs. The old sign said no hunting, trapping, or fishing. And then maybe 35 years ago, they replaced the signs with no hunting, swimming, or fishing because nobody knew what trapping was anymore. Believe it or not, people used to trap in Fairfield County, Connecticut in the 1900s, some for a living even, muskrats and things, or at least part of a living. But the way this tree and nature kind of taking over the sign is just symbolic of a lot of what I've tried to communicate through my work, that I'm really interested in how humans draw lines in the landscape and how all those lines are ultimately ephemeral, even the Great Wall of China or the border wall between the United States and Mexico. Ultimately, they'll all come down. But I always, felt like I saw deer and turkeys and squirrels cross this invisible boundary, and I was like, well, why can't I? Just because there's a sign there, it doesn't make sense. So testing boundaries has been, at least gently, something I've loved to do. But I love the way the maple tree is sort of growing around the no trespassing and sort of almost inviting you to trespass. And it's sort of tearing the sign in half, and oxidization is happening. And at the base, you can't really see that well, but there's barbed wire fence that the tree is growing around, an old farmer's fence. So it's sort of in multiple ways pulling boundaries apart. My father introduced me to birds when I was a kid. This is the obligatory child with bird shot. But he wasn't afraid to pick up a dead magnolia warbler that had hit the window in our home and died and put it in my hands. And at that point, I was already drawing a lot. I was copying paintings by Audubon and Luis Agassiz Fuertes and Roger Torrey Peterson. So I was painting and drawing from books from people who had already made observations directly, and I was making observations based on their observations, representing their representations. But then I also had access directly to nature itself and things like dead birds, which had a very big impact on me, I think. I can remember holding that bird and feeling how light it was, and even still warm when they were fresh. This is an early drawing copying I think Bachman's warbler. Christoph could tell us, but I don't think he's not. He's shaking his head. Okay, Lawrence's. I think I wrote it right underneath. Sorry, but I think that was a hybrid warbler that isn't considered a species anymore. But I didn't care at the time. So yeah, I first started drawing birds, and then I became interested in fish. A friend of mine introduced me to fishing around the age of 9, and I became particularly obsessed with our local brook trout, our native trout. I can't say why, but some of you in the room have also found trout to be beautiful. And they're just colorful. They live in moving water, which is just nice to be around. They don't sort of give themselves up easily. You kind of have to sneak up on them, and there was a, with fishing, looking back on it, a kind of even communication that was happening. If you're into fly fishing or something like that, you know that you basically take a hook and you tie fur and feathers to the hook to make an imitation of something in nature, a food item that they're eating, like an insect. So you're making a little representation or sculpture of an insect. You think it looks like an insect, and you throw that thing out into a stream, and the insect imitation is floating down. You're trying to present it naturally. And if a trout or some other fish acknowledges that thing, even looks at it, or turns sort of out of its normal daily activities to look at it, or even come up and eat it, its trout brain also has acknowledged that that looks like an insect or something edible. So in a sense, this representation of an insect has allowed a human to communicate with a non-human animal. And I think one of the most intimate ways of associating with animals historically has been through predation. Ironically, with fishing, most of my fishing, I tortured them and let them go. So the end game wasn't to eat them. But there was this interface that I can't describe how meaningful it was to me as a kid, especially when, life was turbulent at home or whatever. I could go down to the local stream and kind of connect with a fish. And I knew them on a very intimate level. I was photographing them all with my dad's old 35 millimeter Nicker mat, and I get the film developed. And then one day I was looking at the pictures. I was like, over a 2-year period, I was like, this is the same fish. I caught the same fish 3 times in the same pool over a 2-year period. So I knew the fish, because you can recognize them by their spotting patterns. I knew the fish not just as a species like a brook trout, but as individuals. And I don't think I'll ever have that kind of intimate relationship with my local environment again. I just will never spend that much time. So I started drawing the fish, and that was another kind of form of representation that I was engaged in, drawing the fish on paper to communicate my love of the fish, maybe to another human. So there was the artifice of making an imitation of insect to sort of have this communication with the fish, which we also do through duck decoys and even imitating the sounds of animals to draw them closer. I was reading one culture in Siberia where they hunt reindeer. They will even put on a reindeer coat with the antlers and dance around to sort of bring the deer closer, so they can shoot them. But they're afraid that if their imitation is too good, that they can actually turn into or move into the world of the reindeer and not be able to return to the world of the human, which I think is also very interesting. One of the threads that I've also followed my whole life is, we do the same thing through language. We use words, which are representations of things, to communicate. And if we mistake the imitation world for the real world, bad things can happen, or just things can happen. So I started drawing the trout, but I couldn't find a book on the trout of North America equivalent to, a field guide to the birds or something like my father had on our shelf at home. So I started writing letters. Back then we went to the library, as some of you remember, because the internet didn't exist. And my father always said you could learn anything you wanted to make or do at the library. So we went to the library a lot. But I couldn't find a book that had all the trout of North America in it, and I was obsessed with trout. So I started writing letters at 12 years old to departments of wildlife around the country, Nevada Department of Fish and Game or whatever, asking, what kind of native trout live there, mostly handwritten letters. And I got very nice responses from biologists who'd sometimes studied a particular type of trout their whole lives, like the Humboldt River cutthroat trout or the Snake River fine-spotted cutthroat trout. And I tried to make a list of all the species of trout in North America because I wanted to paint them all. They also sent photos, and I developed correspondences with some of these people. Some of them I'm still in touch with. Some of them offered to take me out on, once I had my driver's license, I was driving up to remote parts of Maine to see some relict population of Arctic char that had survived the last glaciation and the blueback trout or whatever. So I started putting a list of the species together, but I learned very quickly that no two biologists could agree on how many species there were, and they couldn't really agree on what a species even was. And this was very confusing to a 12-year-old who thought that, who grew up in field guides that had, basically a page of pictures of birds lined up neatly like soldiers in a battalion, and then on the opposite page, all the names. I didn't know that people were still debating where to draw lines in nature and what the meaning of those lines were. But as it turns out, simultaneously, my father who was a school teacher in the sciences, was reading these popular evolutionary biologists, Stephen Jay Gould and E.O. Wilson, and he was talking a lot about evolutionary biology. So I was like, well, this kind of makes sense, because if things are evolving on this great evolutionary timeline, it's not that easy sometimes to know where to draw lines, because, the separation hasn't necessarily always happened that clearly. And trout, as it turns out, are very difficult to classify because of the nature of the way they evolved. Every 20,000 years or wherever there's a glaciation, most of their range gets frozen. So they have to retreat to the oceans or die over time, or find little refuges where the ice doesn't form. And then when the ice melts, they recolonize the rivers, and the old sort of variety that survived in the lakes is still close enoughly related to the one that escaped, and they hybridize. So it's very messy. Anyway, for practical reasons, I needed to paint the fish for a book. So I just basically painted any individual fish that had been named by somebody, and kind of explained that there's no real agreement, but I just wanted to make some kind of document of the biodiversity of the trout of North America. So I kind of had to put the names aside as a sort of historical artifact and just, paint the things, and recognizing that this was not a perfect, or never would be, project. So I was able to find a publisher. I sent out 10 proposals when I was a freshman at Yale, and found a publisher to do this book. It came out my junior year. It was called Trout, oddly enough. And it did well enough that I was able to continue to see if I could make a living writing and painting, which is what I've been doing ever since. My second book on trout was a book of paintings of the trout of Europe and Asia and North Africa. So I found out there were trout around the rest of the Northern Hemisphere. So I thought, well, I'll start trying to look for them. So this is a trout from Slovenia and northern Japan. So I spent 7 years off and on traveling around looking for native trout in places like the headwaters of the Euphrates in eastern Turkey, or the headwaters of the Tigris. The Euphrates and Tigris are interesting for trout evolution because the trout didn't come up they didn't colonize those rivers from the Persian Gulf. They came across mountain divides from the Caspian, Mediterranean, and Black Sea drainages during times when you wouldn't think a trout could cross the continental divide or different divides, mountain ranges. But in times in past when there was more meltwater from post-glacial times, there was more water and sometimes in passes between mountain ranges, and trout could actually come up one headwater and into the next. So there are Pacific fish that came from the Pacific Ocean on the east side of the continental divide. Like in Yellowstone National Park, there's cutthroat trout, which came out of the Pacific Ocean, but Yellowstone is in the Atlantic drainage. All the rivers flow to the Atlantic Ocean. So becoming really fanatical about trout made me look at the world in terms of river drainages more than, borders of countries and things like that. This is a trout from the headwaters of the Tigris, which we were the first people to, well, actually, I wasn't there, but the first time we tried, it was too, we couldn't get to the places we wanted to because the Kurdish people were fighting the Turkish military, and we were getting stopped all the time by military people, and it was impossible to get anywhere. But my friend Johannes went back and was able to catch one of these and photograph it. We did find trout in the Euphrates headwaters, but these are trout from a little stream in northern island of Japan, Hokkaido. They're just pretty little things. There's a Mongolian rental car. This is a Mongolian boy holding a Arctic grayling. One of the fun things was that if there's water, usually there's fish, and there's usually people who try to catch the fish to eat. So if we knew the local word for trout, like in Turkish, it's alabalık, or Italian trota, or Japan, oshirokomo, or there's many different names for trout. The word for trout and the word for beer, we were pretty much, good anywhere we went. But people would appear out of nowhere. We were holding fishing rods, and they would try to help us catch a fish. It was really kind of fun. So after many, many years, probably from 9 to 22, painting trout, I realized there were things I wanted to say that weren't as much about just trout, but about our interaction with nature, particularly naming and ordering nature. So some of the first paintings I did that weren't just trout were these hybrid creatures that were kind of meant to be tongue-in-cheek, like creatures that became their names in protest of us trying to make sense of them through language, like a parrotfish. There's a reef fish many of you have seen called parrotfish that have a mouth that is hard for crunching coral. They actually eat coral and they poop out sand. There's some statistics like that 70% of the sand beaches in the Caribbean are parrotfish poop. So next time you put your head on the beach, you can think about that. So this is a literal parrotfish, and it sort of was also, tied to my interest in early colonization when Europeans had the technology to go abroad, and they were looking for things that were valuable to them, but also kind of bringing back pieces of animals as curiosities. And nobody had seen them in life. They were just sort of pieces of dead specimens. Famously, they brought home skins of birds of paradise, and the local people had taken their feet off of them, and Linnaeus described it. I think the Latin name is something. Who can remind me? Apoda, without feet. And there were all these drawings of birds of paradise that never landed on trees, and they copulated in the air, and they'd lay an egg and just kind of toss it around like a hot potato till it hatched. So I love this idea of a time when we knew less about the world. It was almost better than now when we think we know everything. So these were just meant to be sort of pages from a quack naturalist notebook who went around trying to figure things out. It was totally wrong. But like a turtle dove, in this case, a passenger pigeon with the shell of a box turtle. And this is a cockatool. It has a Swiss Army knife for a crest. So I started doing these tool birds because in conservation, we have all these prejudices and priorities about what we want to protect. And in this case, we start protecting things that are useful to us. So animals started to evolve to be useful so we wouldn't kill them. The cockatools are very popular. And the drill ducks. This duck has a drill bit making holes in the wood. Like Flintstones kind of stuff. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember the Flintstones, but there were brooms that were bird tails and things. If you become, interested in naming and ordering nature, you become interested in stories about naming nature. One of the most prominent ones in the Western world is the biblical story of Adam and Eve. And Adam's first task is to put names on the things in the Garden of Eden from God. So God basically takes the holistic, interconnected universe and he starts fragmenting it. He separates light from darkness and air from water. He takes a bunch of dirt from the ground, makes humans, and then he's like, okay, Adam, you carry on this business. And in a way, naming is also a fragmentation of the world because you have to take an interconnected world and draw lines between things and label the pieces. So there's some criticism about this process being a way of dominating nature, and in a way that's partly true, but it's also necessary for communication. One of my favorite naming stories that's a commentary on this is by Ursula Le Guin. It's a one-page story called She Unnames Them. And in the story, Eve goes through the garden unnaming all the animals. And when she's done, she hands her own name back to Adam as kind of a feminist protest and walks out of the garden. Because she thought that once there were names on things, it created this us versus them scenario that we're no longer part of the same thing, but we're fragmented. I spent a couple trips and quite a bit of time in a little island in Micronesia called Ponape. I was working on a book about freshwater eels, and there's a clan of people that live there that worship eels. They consider eels to be their human ancestors. They have a very cool relationship with eels. These are similar to our freshwater eels in that they spawn in the middle of the ocean, but live their adult lives in fresh water. And there's not a lot of fresh water in Micronesia. So they're essentially growing up to become ocean-going animals that will go back to spawn 1,000 miles away in potentially 300-meter deep water. We don't know because we've never seen them spawn. But anyway, so these eels get big. They're really wild. But that's not the story of this. I learned when I was there that the people had very interesting stories about naming plants and plant uses, and what they were willing to share was, generous and not the whole story, but they have a story, their own naming story, where two boys go out in the forest, and instead of telling the names, the plants what their names are, they ask the plants what their names are, and they receive the names from the plants. So to me, that's a very nice alternative to the Adam story. I've engaged in, because I've been writing a book forever that I'll hopefully finish before I die, about naming and ordering nature. It's just such a big topic and I can't let go of it. But as part of that inquiry, I wanted to, through Dave Skelly and Christoph at the Peabody, I learned that people still go on expeditions to try to find things that haven't been named and put names on them. It's a very important process because if we don't know what's out there, we can't talk about it, protect it, whatever. So I wanted to go on a biological expedition and write a chapter about it for my book, the process people go through to name things. So Christoph identified an area of central Suriname. I don't know if this has a pointer on it, but yeah, it does. This area that there never really been a significant biological expedition, and it was thought by Conservation International to be one of the largest untouched tropical forests in the world. So if you can go to a place where people haven't been, at least in modern times, there's a good chance there's something there that hasn't been named yet. Because if people have been there, think that everything has names, even individual rocks. And this is an area where people really never would have had a reason to live. There's high diversity of creatures, but not a very dense population of creatures. So you couldn't really make a living very well there. It's rocky, it's mountainous, there's no navigable rivers. So I don't really see that there's no evidence that people really ever spent any significant time there, unless maybe they were going up the mountain for ritual reasons. But this is the highest point, and part of the Guianian Shield, which is where those famous tepuis are, the flat top tabletop mountains was. So anyway, so we went up there. Helicopter is the only way you can get up there. There are 3 helicopters in the country. We had to wait about a week to get a weather window, but even then, we ended up flying into fog and had to almost make a crash landing in the forest. Anyway, naming things can be dangerous. But we got to the site where we wanted to go and spent 3 weeks. And for me, as somebody who loves to draw things, there was just an endless amount of beauty. Toads and frogs and orchids, and there was also dead material for me to draw from, which, you know, is very much part of the traditional artist, naturalist, scientist tradition. Darwin drew, Linnaeus drew, Maria Sibylla Merriam drew. Drawing for me has also been like a foundation of everything that I do, and I believe in it strongly, even as part of scientific inquiry, as a way to heighten your skills of observation, among other things. We put up a light at night. We brought a little generator to run a light. There's probably never been a light on at night, not an artificial light in this area ever. So the moths were very confused, and there were a lot of them. And that moth in the center has the largest wingspan potentially of any insect in the world. But oddly enough, no one's ever studied its life history. They have identified the caterpillar, but only one person, as far as we know. We've been on this white witch watch for 15 years now. Anyway, that's one of hopefully the lifelong boondoggles I'll engage in, is trying to find the life history of this very interesting moth. There were venomous things. I had, just beautiful things. One of the things that's occurred to me too, drawing over the years, is that the living colors of things fade so quickly as things are dying. And that, of course, I learned from fish. And I would try to photograph the trout and let them go, because once they were dead, the colors were completely gone. This is also very much true for large pelagic fish. And I did a series of paintings of ocean fish, life-size, like swordfish, bluefin tuna, blue marlin, and traveled to places where I could see these fish. But they're flickering with colors and light, and then the sort of light goes out. Anyway, it was a pretty place. There's Christoph with a bird from the net, which he's still writing a paper about naming as a new species. Hasn't finished yet. Let's go, Christoph. A couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to do kind of an interdisciplinary exhibition at the Yale University Art Gallery, where I was able to combine objects from the Peabody Museum of Natural History and the art gallery with works of my own. So I was able to do really fun things like juxtapose the head of a Torosaurus, potentially the largest skull of any land animal ever, with a sculpture by Barbara Hepworth from the British Art Center, and a mural of silhouettes that I did of passenger pigeons flying through a forest of American chestnuts, kind of about extinction and stuff. I just like the way those two things look together, but a lot of the juxtapositions had more meaning. Unfortunately, the show was open for about 2.5 weeks, and then the pandemic shut it down. But whoops. So this was one of the installations that I did that was particularly meaningful to me. It took about 2 years of jockeying and arguing with Rick Prum to let me pin the birds to the wall in a color spectrum, but these are specimens from, Rick's not here, is he? Even if he was, he eventually was very nice about it. So thank you, Rick, and Christoph, and Dave. I took about 250 birds out of the 150,000 birds in the Peabody collection, one of the 10 largest in the world, and I wanted to arrange them in the form of a color spectrum, not just because I thought it would be beautiful and historically interesting, but because a color spectrum, I thought that there could be a cool association you could draw between the color spectrum and the evolutionary continuum, that really nature is an undivided continuum. When we say the color red, there really isn't there's no place in nature where red ends and orange begins. If you take a bucket of red paint and add a drop of yellow at a time, we can define that space, but really continuums are continuums. So in the evolutionary continuum, again, sometimes it's not that easy to know where to draw lines in order to name or identify new species or subspecies or varieties. Darwin, wrote about this a lot. He said that species were arbitrary terms for convenience. Yet we hold on so tightly to these boundaries. And I think to our detriment. Species, of course, are an important concept. And yes, there are aspects of species that are real. But at the same time, things are, I'm telling this to a room full of ecologists, but interacting in a space where we don't know how they're even affecting the evolution of each other or influencing the way they develop. It's just too complex to ever know. So part of what my work is about is reminding us that the maps we create to navigate the world, like language, taking an interconnected whole, chopping it in pieces, fragmenting it. So we take nature, this complex, interconnected, constantly changing thing, we chop it up in pieces, we label the pieces, we reduce complexity and we fragment it. We say tree, which is necessary because we can't name every individual tree in the world, Harry, Tom, Josephine, and Dick, you know, because we couldn't, a phone book with the name of every tree would not be a useful way to communicate. That would be like making a map that's the same size as the world. You can't fit it in your pocket. It just doesn't work. Maybe now with computers and phones, we could do that in a more useful way. But essentially, we have to reduce complexity in order to have a form of communication. We can't expect language or the Linnaean system to do everything. It's just a tool. But sometimes when we create those maps to communicate, we forget that the map is a map because we like it. It came out of our brains. It conforms to the way the human mind works. So of course we're going to like it. And then we mistake the map for the territory, which is something that a philosopher said, that Alfred Corbuche something. I can't remember his name. But that's essentially the crux of what most of my work is about, that humans draw these lines and then forget the lines actually, even if they're invisible, can have an impact on the world. So that's the bird spectrum. And they also had all these beautiful handwritten labels from all the people who'd traveled around the world the last 150 years trying to find and explain this biodiversity. You know, and there is an element of possession and control in the process. There's an element of killing and collecting. It's not always clean and beautiful. It's controversial, which is part of what's interesting about it. So I make these other works that are kind of about how humans try to bring order to nature, bend nature to our will. This piece is called The Myth of Order. It's basically stitched together pieces of curved birch where I put clay and paint in the seams and make it look like it's not connected to the world. And the branches made out of clay. I've been over the years, I think, attracted to animals that don't obey boundaries or need to move over huge areas of space to kind of play out their life histories, like the freshwater eel, which spawns in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in this gyre called the Sargasso Sea, but spends its adult lives in rivers, lakes, and streams and fresh water. So it's crossing this boundary between the land and the sea. These are baby eels. As I mentioned before, I spent 12 years writing a book about eels. I'm always working on multiple projects at once, but eels occupied a lot of my space for a while. The young eels are called glass eels because they are transparent. That's what they look like when they first enter fresh water from where they're born in the ocean. They slowly become pigmented. They call them elvers. They look like little black shoelaces. At this stage, they're very good at climbing. They can climb up vertical walls if they're moist. There was a dam, I think on the Mianus River, where I was observing in Greenwich, Connecticut, these eels going up this mossy, wet part of a dam, not quite vertical, but pretty steep, and to get over the dam. And next to the dam, there was a concrete like pump house or something. And it had rained a lot, and there was water coming from the gutter down the side of the building. And eels had gone up the side of the building all the way to the gutter. And then when the water dried up, they just dried on the side of the building. There were probably like 10,000 dried eels on the side of the building. So they're just relentless, and they're really good. If I had a spirit animal, I would think it would be the eel. They're incredible creatures. This is the largest earthen dam in the North Island in New Zealand. They have a really interesting, huge freshwater eel, the longfin, that's very important to the Maori culture. So I spent a lot of time in Polynesia with the Maori people learning about the importance of eels. There's Maori people who catch the baby eels in traps and hand carry them over the dam because they care about them so much. And they do the same thing with the adults coming downstream, because the downstream journey is much more perilous because eels go through these turbines and hydroelectric dams and get chopped up. So we're losing a lot of populations of migratory species because of boundaries and impediments. So I'm interested in conceptual boundaries, like between words, word walls that we create between names, but also manifested physical boundaries like dams, fences. So that's an eel that got chopped up in a turbine in a dam in Maine, of a non-functioning hydroelectric dam that wasn't even generating electricity. This is a map of what the historic range of the eel is, and this is what it is, all chopped up and fragmented because of loss of habitat. This is a work I made from taking a dead eel and stamping it over and over on the paper, probably a couple hundred times, to create a swarm. We've never witnessed the spawning aggregations of eels in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but the few biologists who study eels think that they call it a panmixia, basically a giant eel orgy. They have to get close enough to each other so that when they release the eggs and sperm that they actually can get fertilized, which is how I think all fertilization happens in fish, right? It's external. I worked on another project for years that was about the invisible line around Yellowstone National Park and how that affects the animals that migrate in and out of the park seasonally, with a graduate of this school named Arthur Middleton and a photographer named Joe Reese. This is the north part of Yellowstone, the north entrance. This is the line that was drawn around the park in 1862, 62, by Ferdinand Hayden, a geologist. It was protected because of the thermal features, but then of course people realized how important it was for wildlife. It was in part this collaboration between a scientist, Ferdinand Hayden, a painter, Thomas Moran, and a photographer, William Henry Jackson, who helped convince Congress to protect this piece of land in the late 19th century. And that was all good. But since then, that line has become symbolic of public and private. And inside the park, an animal can be protected as a sort of tourist feature. Outside the park, it can be shot as a trophy animal. Not necessarily passing judgment on that, but I'm saying is that line, crossing that line, even though there's no fence there, has consequences. This is part of Arthur's work where he was putting together data from all these migratory herds of elk that move in and out of the park seasonally. We were mostly spending time with the Cody herd in the east, but something I didn't know before I did this project, that a lot of the animals, if not the majority of them, leave the park in the winter because it's so hostile. Obviously, there's people in the room here who study this, so excuse me for being a little over-explanatory. This is one of Joe Reese's photographs of a pronghorn who got its leg caught in a barbed wire fence. So fences and walls do impede migration. This is a piece I did with all these moths. I wanted to create this sort of swarm of these army cutworm moths. They're not colorful in real life, but this is a really interesting Yellowstone story. Interesting to me that these moths emerge from caterpillars or from cocoons in the central part of the country in Kansas, Nebraska. They fly as adults into the high country of Wyoming and Montana, and they hide up against snowfields under rocks by the millions. And grizzly bears have figured out in the summer, if they go up there and roll rocks over, that they can munch on tens of thousands of moths. And they've counted as many as 40 to 60,000 moths a day, I guess, by going through their poop religiously. That's why I'm not a biologist. I don't have the patience for that. Or maybe that's what graduate students are for. I'm not. But I wanted to sort of express this, that they say some people as much as 70% of the diet of grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in the summer come from these army cutworm moths. And that's a resource that started 1,000 miles away in the Great Plains. This is a hybrid creature I did, sort of just commenting on the wild versus the so-called domestic the barbed wire, the sage grouse. This is the lower falls of Yellowstone, I think, the famous Artist Point where Thomas Moran and Bierstadt and other people painted, just to show that there are natural barriers in nature. I mean, humans aren't the only people that make barriers, and these barriers that happen geologically are obviously impediments to migration of fishes and things like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about a current show I have up in Texas at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art, and then I'll stop talking. But this is a Texas flag where I put a bison and some big bluestem grass crossing the boundaries, because a lot of our flags are about lines and blocks of color, and they don't really, there are some flags that have organic matter on them. The Mexican flag has an eagle and a snake, I think the Egyptian flag, but our flag, our US flag, doesn't have anything that acknowledges nature on it. And I did an American flag version, but I just sort of put these things, breaking the lines a little bit, softening the boundaries, because this show is about prairies, and the two things that prairies required to exist were migrating herds of grazing animals like bison and fire. And excuse me if I'm explaining this to people who study this more than I do. But it's new to me and it's fascinating, so I'm going to just talk about it a little bit. But the show's called Trespassers because, again, the forces that the prairies needed don't obey boundaries. You can't just set a fire now that'll burn hundreds of thousands of acres. And fire, I've become obsessed with fire lately because of this project, that basically there was this significant clash in ideologies between the native people who lived more of a nomadic life and the Europeans who came and lived a sedentary life. And the indigenous people set fire to the land constantly. This is as far as what I can tell from the research I've been doing. And they did this to burn the land, to suppress the growth of trees and brush and create more grass, because more grass equals more higher population of grazing animals. They were managing the land for their own purposes, which is what humans do. The Europeans came, they had ideas of land ownership and property lines. They put up fences and built semi-permanent dwellings. No dwelling is permanent. And all of a sudden, that was the end of this way of living that had existed for thousands of years, using fire as a tool to burn the land. Because if a fire started even by lightning that wasn't anthropogenic fire, they would put it out. And then they were like, where'd all the grass go? And they started watching the brush grow back, and they overgrazed the land because they put too many animals on it, and the prairies became destroyed. So it's one of the most endangered ecosystems in our country and in the world are the grasslands. They say that less than 1% of prairies survive. I think it's much closer to zero. And one of the big revelations for me in this project has been reading books like William Cronin's Changes in the Land, Yale graduate, and Stephen Pine's Fire in America, and many others. The literature is great and significant, and the accounts from early Europeans of the methods of burning, the frequency of burning. The indigenous people burned recklessly, they burned carefully, they burned with beautiful intent, they burned for fun, they burned to open areas of forest, through Sweden, slash and burn to create openings for sunlight to grow crops. They burned because they probably knew that creating openings in forests makes a more sort of diverse mosaic of habitats. You have grasses, you have succession happening, animals like edges. They increase the biodiversity in the land by burning. And then after thousands of years of doing this, the burning stops. It's like the land is in a state of, basically withdrawal. It's like taking alcohol away from an alcoholic after, 40 years of drinking. I mean, that's not a good metaphor. Maybe we can come up with a better, but it's not, I don't think it's, I think this is significant, and I'm really surprised that as a kid growing up in Connecticut, I was never taught, fire was never part of the narrative of ecology in New England. And it's a huge part of the history. anyway, this is a piece I did with all these silhouettes of prairie animals from Texas. This is what the prairies used to look like. These are liatris, the beautiful purple things. And this is largely what the prairies look like now. It's not unlike what we do to nature when we name and order things. We fragment it in pieces, we put it in boxes, and then we expect that to sort of be everything. Some people, not everybody. But I think that anyway, some of the only places that the native prairie survives are places that sort of accidentally escaped the plow, like old cemeteries, where because people buried their dead there since the early 1800s when there was still prairie. You can find some old rare prairie plants in these old cemeteries. This cemetery in North Texas had some wooden headstones made of bodark wood. This is my friend who really helped me a lot to teach me about these grasslands and take me to little remnant prairies he knew about, Matt White. He even pulled up one of these headstones to show me that the wood, even though it was probably 150 years old, was still completely unrotten and then put it right back. Thought that was a little bold, but this is a remnant prairie cemetery or cemetery prairie in Missouri. We just traveled a lot around to see these little patches of, this is a painting I did. So I painted these grasses and wildflowers, this one in the form of a cross loosely to allude to this cemetery prairie idea that, you know, nature's kind of up on the cross in a way. And then when I came home from those first trips to Texas, I didn't know this, but I was told that a lot of the tall grass prairie species are also native to New England. This is big bluestem that I found near my house in Easton, Connecticut, and roundhead bush clover. And so anyway, there's just clues that there was a lot more grass in the places where I grew up, and I never knew this. This is a little restoration site on our property where I'm trying to grow some native grasses like yellow Indian grass and just watching what happens. And last January I burned it without anybody's permission, just because I have a propane torch and it's fun. So I tried to make sculptures that alluded to this idea of fire as a regenerative force. These are burned logs that I cast in bronze and then make these clay flowers growing out of them. Those are prairie paintbrush. I particularly love these, what have been called Indian paintbrush or painted cups, the Castanea genus. I kind of get obsessed with certain kinds of plants and animals and I can't let go. This is a self-portrait. It's supposed to be like as a burned log, showing how important just fire has been for humans. I don't have a really succinct narrative about it yet, but I'll make one. These are pieces of burned grasses from a fire. And this is the historic range of the prairie chicken. You can see that lesser prairie chickens were native to the East Coast, which is one piece of evidence that we had a lot more grass than we do now. Prairie chickens went extinct in the mainland here probably in the 1880s, and in Martha's Vineyard finally in the 1920s. This is a heath hen, as they called them, from the Peabody Museum. I think this specimen's from Massachusetts. I don't think we have one from Connecticut. Christoph told me we have one from Connecticut, but he thinks it was bought in a market in Ohio and bought in a market in New Haven and not collected in Connecticut. So, but again, the Indian paintbrushes, I'll end with these plants. I wanted to see if we had native Indian paintbrush to Connecticut. It happens that we do. We do in New England. Castanea coccinea is the species, and in 2001 I found a paper that said it was absent from all of New England except 4 populations in Connecticut. Now they think it's down to 1 population in Connecticut. It's on a private farm in Sherman. So far I haven't been able to get access, but if I know where it is, I'm going to trespass eventually. But I wanted to see how prevalent these things were. So I went in online, and you can search the herbarium specimens at the Peabody. And lo and behold, there's a lot of specimens that were collected in the 1850s, 1860s in New Haven County, Fairfield County. So this tells me something. These are plants that are hemiparasitic. They attach their roots to the roots of grasses to gain some of their nutrients. They're essentially prairie plants. They're mountain plants too, and that's where I first fell in love with them in the mountains of Wyoming. But I've since realized that those are also kind of grasslands because they're up in the mountains above tree line or in place sagebrush steppes or prairies. So they're essentially a prairie plant. So if you can find a paintbrush, you're in a grassland most likely, or on a mountain above tree line, or whatever habitat you call it, doesn't matter. I mean, the problem with ideas of separate ecosystems is that they're all interconnected anyway, and there's animals moving back and forth between them. So we can't get too hung up on separate ecosystems. I try not to. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You're ecologists. I'm just an artist. But anyway, but look at these beautiful plants collected. This one in Hawleyville, Connecticut, just north of where I live in Easton. This was in Wintergreen Lake, Hamden, 1884. West Rock Meadows, Hamden, May 22nd, 1868. Something's changed, and I don't know what it is, but I'm really interested in it. Maybe you can help me. I'll make this the last slide. This is just some deer jumping over a barbed wire fence, this silhouette mural I did, and symbolic of nature trespassing across boundaries. Thank you all for having me. Indy, thank you for inviting me. And thank you. Thank you. Oh, I didn't get to talk about shadows. Do I? Next lecture.
Time for a couple quick questions.
Oh, here's some historic fire paintings.
One question, probably. Yeah.
One question.
Any takers? Oh, there's one on Zoom. Okay. Okay. What sort of boundaries do you see between fire for ecosystems and fire as a greenhouse gas source?
Well, I'm not a climate scientist, but I am working on an article about climate change in the Gulf of Maine for National Geographic. But I don't know what I know that there are people studying the consequences of burning and smoke even thousands of years ago. I don't know what it did to the upper atmosphere, how it affected climate necessarily. But one interesting story I heard from a biologist at UC Berkeley, Stephanie Carlson, who studies Pacific salmon. She said there's evidence, and they're studying this, that the range of the Pacific salmon was extended south in California because the smoke from indigenous fires was so prevalent that it kept the streams cooler in the summer. And that salmon, for so long enough that salmon were able to extend their ranges into warmer, historically warmer streams. So that tells you something, if that's actually true, that this was not like some kind of occasional thing that was done. It was done intentionally, and it was done systematically, and it was done for a long time. And that's going to change habitats. It's going to change the composition of creatures. It's going to change everything. So yeah, could we burn today without there being consequences? There'd probably be good things and bad things. There's always winners and losers with all these things. So, but we tend to, use practices that benefit our survival. It's just what we do.
Okay, we're gonna have to take
Thank you. Andy, thank you. Thank you so much. So thank